Hello, in this video I want to answer the question: how was Germany able to conquer so much territory after World War I? And here on this map you can see all the territory controlled by the Axis powers in 1942. And you can see that Japan was also doing pretty well. But here on this map what becomes obvious is that in 1942 all the countries in Europe except for Great Britain and the Soviet Union were either conquered by Hitler, his allies, or neutral towards him. And even if you look at the neutral countries like Sweden and Spain, while they were in theory neutral, Spain was still selling oil to Hitler and sending volunteers, which is why the Spanish Legion also fought on the Eastern Front against the Soviets, and Sweden also sent volunteers, and even Ireland. Well, Ireland was truly neutral, just like Switzerland, but many also sympathized with Hitler simply because they hated the British so much, and I can blame them after being oppressed by the British for quite a long time. Not to mention that many at the time didn't realize how evil Hitler was. But okay, let us try and explain this weird phenomenon. How was Nazi Germany, with the population of somewhere around 80 million men, and even if we are talking about an enlarged Germany with a population of 80 million men, able to conquer, well, not just all this Soviet territory, and able to conquer it after Stalin industrialized the Soviet Union quite successfully. So we are no longer talking about the First World War Russia, that was a very backwards country, and he was also able to conquer France, and actually by conquering France he conquered the French colonial empire to a large extent. The French were also able to use people from their colonies, but they didn't help them. So it is truly remarkable that Germany, after the humiliating defeat of World War I, was managed to come back so quickly and come back with a vengeance. So they lost 12% of their territory. Some of their most prosperous regions were given to Poland and Czechoslovakia. Their entire air force was confiscated by the Allies, and their entire war navy was confiscated by the Allies as well. And all of their colonies were lost, so they no longer had access to some very useful resources that they needed for the war, such as oil, for example, or aluminium, and which is why they had to rely on resources that were sold to them from Spain, and in the early phase of the war from the Soviet Union. And also they had to pay quite a lot of money to France for a long time, and their military was for a long time forced to only have 100,000 men, while the French and the British enlarged their colonial empires and continued to develop their militaries. So it does seem truly weird that in the Second World War Germany was so much more successful. But if we analyze what happens, it actually stops being that weird. So here we can see that Axis powers were also quite successful, even if we don't count the French colonies as territories controlled by Germany. So the main reason for the early success of Hitler in World War II is the fact that Hitler, at least at first, didn't have to fight a two-front war. After the quick defeat of Poland, Hitler could fight France without fighting Russia. And in the First World War, the Franco-Russian alliance was one of the greatest problems for Germany. The Schlieffen Plan in the World War I failed because Kaiser Wilhelm underestimated how quickly Russia is able to mobilize its troops. And what people often forget is that World War I was almost over in the very beginning, because Russians started to advance into Germany quite rapidly, and if it wasn't for Hindenburg winning the Battle of Tannenberg, and he won the battle against a twice time larger Russian force, he managed to save Germany from just getting occupied quite early in the war. He prevented the Russians from reaching Berlin. And yeah, as I already said, this Franco-Russian alliance was quite problematic for Germany, but now that alliance no longer existed because, well, the Soviet Union was communist, and we shouldn't just blame Stalin for not being a French ally, because the French are also to blame, and I'll explain why later. So yeah, the first thing that made Hitler's job easier is the fact that there was a split between communism and capitalism, and both sides kind of hoped to use Hitler as a tool to weaken the other side, which is why, for example, the French and the British did nothing while Hitler was helping Franco in Spain, because the Spanish fascists were battling for the most part communists after all, and that is the same reason why Stalin in 1939 said, well, look, if Hitler is going to attack Poland and Poland is allied with the French and the British, why should I intervene? I'll simply let them fight and then attack the winner. Which is kind of what the Allies were also planned on doing. It was definitely in their interest for Hitler to weaken Stalin, in the same way in which it was in Stalin's interest to weaken the British and French colonial empires. And he hoped that maybe he can cause a revolution in the colonies while Hitler is attacking France. And well, the plan kind of backfired, but in the long run French colonies were liberated, but after Hitler killed somewhere around 30 million Soviets, and the Soviet Union never recovered really from that huge demographic loss. And what also needs to be said is that through a bizarre set of circumstances, Germany was in many ways in a better geopolitical situation after World War I than before World War I. And let me explain why that's the case. Well, you can see that after the collapse of the great empires, such as the Russian Empire and Austro-Hungary, Germany was actually surrounded by much smaller states. And Germany was a huge market for the grain and raw resources of those smaller states, which is why they really couldn't form an effective alliance against Germany, because if your main economic partner is Germany, then it is very difficult to go to war with them. And the French had this idea of allying the small Entente, and that was the alliance between the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, Romania and Czechoslovakia. Those countries formed an alliance because they feared Hungary attacking them and taking their territory. But the alliance was formed in such a way, and one of the points of the treaty that was signed said all three countries will base their foreign policy on the common interest, which sort of implies that if Hitler attacks Czechoslovakia, that other countries are forced to intervene. And the French foreign policy for the most of the 1930s was desperately trying to get the countries of the small Entente, they are marked green on this map. The French were desperately trying to get the small Entente to become their ally against Germany, and they were also trying to form an alliance between the small Entente and Poland. But the plan failed, and the main reason for that is that one of the greatest markets for Yugoslav grain was Germany. Somewhere around 60% of all Yugoslav grain was being sold to Germany, which is why Yugoslavia not only refused to go to war with Germany, just like France did, but they also refused to economically sanction Germany or do anything that could have possibly weakened Hitler, and many other Eastern European countries followed their example, which is why Nazi Germany wasn't even significantly damaged by sanctions. Not to mention that nobody in Eastern Europe actually dared to attack Germany. And I do think that if the small Entente was allied with France and Poland, that Germany could have been attacked and kind of taken out of the war before they even attacked Poland. But yeah, the economic reliance of Eastern Germany, of smaller Eastern smaller Eastern European countries on the German giant, on the German economic giant, was one of the main reasons that this idea of the small Entente attacking Germany, or at least economically sanctioning Germany, never came to life. Not to mention that there was one additional reason that really helped Hitler, and that is entire Eastern Europe was full of the German diaspora, and Hitler realized that by creating conflicts between German diaspora and Eastern European countries, he can very easily justify his invasions in the eyes of the international public. For example, both in Austria and in Czechoslovakia, the German nationalists were instructed to start fights with the local authorities, and then when local authorities responded with violence, Hitler claimed that now he's forced to protect his people, and he attacked, and most countries in Europe looked at it as kind of justified. They said, well, yeah, there really is a conflict between Germans and Czechoslovak authorities happening, and yeah, who can blame him for actually protecting his people, is how many people viewed the situation, which is also one of the reasons why nobody decided to intervene quickly enough against Hitler, because he was able to portray conflicts as morally gray and kind of portray an invasion as just him protecting his citizens. And here we can see the Volga-Deutsche. They were also quite a significant minority in the Soviet Union. And let's just say that after Hitler attacked, well, what Stalin did to them, try and guess what happened to them. Let's just say they weren't located here anymore when World War II was over. What happened to them wasn't nice. But yeah, so the influence of the German diaspora is also one of the reasons why the Kingdom of Yugoslavia was reluctant on economically sanctioning Germany or actually doing anything against Germany, and Romania followed its example. So the German economic influence and the influence of the German minorities in Eastern European countries greatly helped Hitler. And this brings us to the Spanish Civil War. Here you can see the communist propaganda posters and the fascist propaganda posters. And one of the greatest mistakes that the French did between two wars is they decided to remain neutral during the Spanish Civil War, because France was a very politically divided country. During the 1930s, the leftists in the country were preventing France from allying with Mussolini, while the right-wingers were preventing France from allying with Stalin. And France was in this way kind of politically paralyzed and unable to do anything except to build its military and build the Maginot Line, but that line didn't help them in the end, as we are about to see later in this video. And so after the Spanish Civil War, the French the French found themselves surrounded by fascist dictatorships, and that wasn't a good place to be in, and they ended up also getting attacked by Italy later in the year 1940, which only quickened the already quick fall of France. And so let us now explain, why did France fall so quickly? Well, Germany had brilliant generals. Here we can see General Manstein. And Manstein actually came up with this brilliant idea of attacking the French through the Ardennes. And it was a very risky move, but Hitler actually approved this move. And that was one of the few good military decisions made by Hitler. While the decision was very risky, it turned out to be effective, and it definitely surprised the French, because at the time people thought that you can't actually break through the Ardennes with tanks, but it turns out you can. And Germany had another brilliant general on their side, Hans Guderian. He was the first that realized that actually all the other countries utilized tanks in a bad way. He realized that the best way to utilize them is to leave your heavy artillery behind and attack, and that way you can move more quickly and surprise the enemy with tanks, which is precisely what the Germans did in the war with France. And here you can see that even after the first tank battle of World War II that took place in France, the Battle of Hanut, that the German tanks were proven to be superior because their ratio of armor thickness and maneuverability was much better than with French tanks that had a quite thick armor that was hard to penetrate, but they weren't so fast, which is why the Germans were able to outflank them. And here you can see German tanks entering Paris, and also Germany had air superiority. Here you can see the Stuka planes devastating the French positions, and the Stukas also had a sound that had a psychological effect on the morale of French troops. They were frightened when they heard the sound of Stukas attacking. And yeah, so air superiority also played quite an important role in the quick fall of France, but Manstein's plan was the reason number one for the quick fall of France. And what also needs to be said, the quick fall of France is what allowed Hitler to attack the Soviet Union, because Nazi Germany actually tripled the amount of its tanks after the quick fall of France by confiscating all the British and the French tanks. And here you can see the Nazi-occupied France. But I also want to say a few words about why was Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union so successful in the beginning, at least. Well, the thing is, Stalin didn't expect Hitler to attack in 1941. Well, why is that? Well, Stalin knew that sooner or later Hitler would attack, but there's that famous quote said by Molotov in 1941, and that is, Hitler isn't as crazy to attack us while he's still fighting the British Empire. But it turns out he was, and in a weird way the reason for his success is the fact that the attack on the Soviet Union was quite a crazy move. And that's why nobody expected it. And also, what you have to bear in mind is the Soviets monitored the amount of winter clothing that the German military had at the time, and it turns out they were seriously lacking in winter clothing and in oil, and that is why the Soviets were convinced they won't attack the Soviet Union. And the German military was partially able to steal winter clothing from the Soviet civilians, but still many German soldiers got sick from having inappropriate clothing, so that was a problem for them. And the lack of oil also became a problem at one point, so many historians argued that actually the most rational thing for Hitler to do in 1941 was to attack the British oil fields in the Middle East first, and then perhaps to attack the Soviet Union. And it was precisely because the German military ultimately did something that was very crazy and actually in the long term irrational. Precisely because of it, their plan almost worked, because the Soviets weren't expecting Hitler to attack in 1941. Not to mention that the Great Purges just finished in the Soviet Union, and that's why the Soviet morale was low in 1941, but the morale became significantly higher after the Soviet people realized that Hitler wants to wipe them out completely. He left them no choice but to fight. And here you can see the Operation Barbarossa, the greatest attack in the history of humanity, as Stalin called it, a treacherous war. And yeah, one other aspect that confused Stalin initially was the fact that Hitler actually never declared war on the Soviet Union. So at first Stalin thought that maybe this was just a localized attack by the disobedient parts of the German military, but yeah, that was initially very confusing for Stalin, because up until then Hitler did declare wars on his neighbors. And here we can see Ludmila Pavlichenko, the female sniper with the greatest death count in history of humanity. She was actually Ukrainian, and she fought against the Germans in the siege of Sevastopol, and she killed 309 German soldiers. Again, Ludmila Pavlichenko here. And yeah, you know the rest of the story. In the end, the Germans overextended their lines, and the Soviets were able to cut them and surround them. The winter and the heavy rains also played a role in stopping the German military, and just the fact that the Soviets were able to outproduce them in tank production, and the fact that the United States joined the war also significantly shortened the war. But yeah, I primarily wanted to explain why was Hitler even so successful in the first half of World War II.